All right. Hi, everyone. Hi, my name is Gabitova. I'm from ChainSafe, and today I'm going to be giving a presentation on why Web3 doesn't have to reinvent Agile. So, to begin this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about both Web3 and Agile, and then just see how they fit together. I wanted to start it with an old proverb that says, everything new is well forgotten old. Now that we're discovering new horizons with Web3, obviously there's new processes, there's new offerings that are on the market. But time and time again, when I read them, I'm a little bit disappointed because I see how they come back to well-established practices, which is a good and a bad thing. So, to begin with, I'm sure most of you are familiar, but let's talk what is Agile. So first off, most of you are probably familiar with Scrum, 2x sprints, planning, grooming, stand-up, all that jazz. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Agile. Agile is the umbrella term under which everything falls. So there's Scrum, there's your XP, Crystal, Scrum at Scale, Less. There's so many things. There's lightweight approaches, heavyweight approaches, whatever you like. But Agile itself is not really a toolbox. It's all the tools, the methodologies that fall under it. Agile itself is more of a philosophy, not to sound too culty. So, best to explain Agile is through the manifesto, which some of you might be familiar with. There's going to be a lot of text on the screen. Don't worry, I'll tell you what to pay attention to. So the manifesto says, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. The key word here is uncovering. So it's a work in progress. That's why there's so many more methodologies that appear under Agile umbrella every single year. Through this work, we come to value individuals' interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, and customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And again, Agile all comes back to responding to change over following the plan. So this is very important to remember that while the things in yellow are highlighted and they're specifically valued, the things in white are still important, and that's what the last sentence of manifesto tells us about. So time and again, when I see people practicing Agile, they focus way too much on the yellow parts, and they completely forget about parts in white, whereas they're still very important. So a good understanding of what Agile is critical to practicing it correctly. So now we talked about Agile. Where does Web3 come into play? What's so special about Web3? Why do we constantly see new practices popping up to manage it? Well, there's a few conditions that are not unique to Web3, but we see them widespread. First up, there's remote and distributed teams. Most of you probably working remotely. I know I am. And teams are distributed all over the world. So obviously that poses some challenges, like it's hard to have sync meetings. Next up, there's DAOs and flat hierarchy. So there's no level of minute management in some Web3 companies. It's managed directly between each other. Thirdly, open source projects obviously requires a different approach than projects of a different nature. And lastly, there's ultra-fast changing market. So what that means is that we have to constantly adapt. Sometimes it's hard to follow a plan. If you started and outlined the whole program for your Web3 company in 2015, and you're trying to implement it now, well, good luck. So now that we've seen what specific conditions there are in Web3, and we kind of know what Agile is about, how does Agile fit in? Well, when we look at the first 2 points, it's all about individuals and interactions. If we don't adapt to how people are working nowadays, if we don't adapt to how our companies are operating, if we focus too much on the processes and tools we inherited from the Web2 or from traditional development, obviously we're going to fail. So, next up, open source and ultra-fast changing market. What do we need to prioritize here? Obviously, it is customer interactions and responding to change. Change is constant, change is here. We need to adapt our plans, and we need to do it fast. So now that we've seen that it seems like Agile fits so well with Web3, well, maybe it works great together. Sorry to tell you that the state of affairs is not that great. So a lot of companies that I personally worked with, and a lot of people who I hear about from in Web3 space, are saying it's just not scrumming. there's some complaints. So the first complaint is meeting fatigue. Here I'm focusing specifically on Scrum because it's the most widespread implemented facet of Agile. Basically about 83% of companies, according to the recent studies who do web development, practice Scrum. So Scrum is your planning, grooming, to experience, et cetera, et cetera. So people are reporting meeting fatigue. There's a lot of meetings. I don't want to be in stand-ups. Fair. Next up, there's rigid sprints. So Scrum usually recommends 1 to 2 to 3 week sprints. People usually stick to 2. And they're saying that the turnaround is just too fast. Like 2 weeks is not enough. They're so rigid, we can't fit our objectives into those 2 weeks timelines. Next up, it's obscuring long-term vision. What I mean by that is that a lot of developers and project managers report that they can't focus on what their long-term objectives are because they're constantly worried about what they're doing in those next 2 weeks. And they're forgetting what they're going towards. And the last issue is that people report that Scrum is hierarchical. So in Scrum, usually there's Scrum Master, there's Product Owner, sometimes there's a Project Manager who does the work of the Product Owner. It depends on the team. And they say that they stand above the people who are on the team. So that creates an unfair hierarchy of the developers. And that creates complaints such as those. So this individual is complaining how they don't use Scrum anymore because there's so many meetings and they feel like they're unproductive, there's wasted time, almost 2 days, I believe, per sprint. So they're proposing their new solutions. So what are the new solutions that are being proposed? Well, the proposals are as follows. A lot of people remove stand-up, so we don't do stand-up meetings anymore. We don't meet up every day and say what we worked on, what our blockers are, etc. Next up, we'll do async meetings. You're probably questioning what async meeting is because it doesn't make sense. Async meeting, usually how it's defined is that you use like a Slack bot or something like that. You just type out the message, what I'm working on, what my issues are, and you contact people directly. So it's more of a chat, not a meeting. Next up, introduce longer timelines. That's my favorite. When people say 2 weeks not enough, we do 1 month, we do 3 months, we do a year. And that's like the scope within we work. As if Scrum was saying that we can't do that. And next up is plan everything in advance. So you, despite Agile so much, you came full circle around to waterfall, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It can still work. You just need to understand if you're using it correctly. So let's see what type of mindset leads to those issues in those proposals. Let's break it down. Usually, we have to question ourselves. Are we a slave to the process? Are we using the toolbox? Are we using the process that were proposed and fitting it to our team? Are we figuring out what actually works for us? So when we are adopting a new methodology, there's a high desire to do it right, to do it how it's supposed to be done, be it Scrum, be it extreme programming, etc. You want to do everything, and you want to do it exactly how it says in the manual book, and that's usually where it falls flat. So time and time again, we see when people are implementing Scrum, and they implement everything indiscriminately, not seeing what works for them, which leads to those aforementioned complaints that I brought up before. Next up, are you setting up for quick development? Are you setting up to build your team? Those are not necessarily one is bad, one is good. It's just a question you have to ask yourself. If you're setting up to develop something really quickly, perhaps you don't need to use all the tools from your toolbox, and perhaps you need to do something very lightweight. So it's the question of adjustment again. And next up, are we adjusting to fit somebody else's expectations, somebody else's processes and demands, or are we setting boundaries? If there is a request to deliver certain metrics that are not critical to your customer delivery, to your goals and objectives, do we have to readjust the whole way we're working just to fit it in? Or can we say, no, this is what works for our team, this is what we need to do, and set those boundaries? So, in the end, what we see is a lot of approaches pop up where the Scrum is being practiced, or Scrum or Agile is being practiced too rigidly, with too much emphasis on following the process, on doing all the opposite things from what Agile is supposed to be, using those tools very rigidly. And a new approach is being created, which in the end ends up being Agile. So a rose by any other name will smell as sweet. So there's a lot of approaches out there. There's the radical adaptation, there's the programmer anarchy, there's the meandering team sync, et cetera, et cetera. The point is that whatever you name it, what matters is what's in the heart of it, what makes this approach work. So what does matter? Like, how do you decide in a sea of different processes, of different toolboxes, of so many different acronyms, what are you supposed to do? Well, how to choose the right path? It's pretty easy, just 4 steps. First up, you need to figure out what works for your team, specifically. You need to figure out what works for your objectives. So prioritize your teams, again, individuals and interactions, customer collaboration over those processes. Don't be a slave to your toolbox. Make it work for you. Next up, your team changes. Why do we choose a process and then we stick to it indiscriminately and we just continue on pretending like we need to fit ourselves to it? No, if your team changes, you have new team members, you have different objectives, you have different goals, everything changed. The process should be reviewed as well. So, and that's exactly what Agile is all about. But if you're using Waterfall, just review it as well. Maybe that would work for you. And again, question your objectives. When I'm talking about forgetting what your objective is when you're working on day-to-day, when you're getting lost in the weeds, you should question your objective. What you're doing right now contributing to your objective? And is your objective contributing to your principles? To what are you trying to achieve? Is it responding to the market still? And lastly, I wanted to note, I know everybody is going to go to their Twitter front page right now and read about different methodologies that will solve all the issues, but please don't trust anybody who says they can solve your issues without knowing what your goals are. There's a lot of excitement out there, and I don't tell you not to try things you want to try. Do try them, but do question them, retro them, reiterate, and see what works. Well, that's the end of it. This is a pretty quick presentation for you today. Keep in touch. This is where you can reach me. Feel free to ask me any questions if you see me around. And hopefully you enjoyed. Thank you.